At 62, Johnny Depp is no longer the eyeliner-wearing rebel who once set Hollywood on fire. The mischief in his eyes has dimmed. The voice is softer now. The movements, slower measured, but behind that weathered face lies something we never expected: clarity. He was once the man every director wanted, every fan adored, and every magazine couldn't stop photographing. A legend, a heartthrob, a myth. But beneath the characters, the costumes, and the chaos was a soul slowly crumbling. Scandals, courtrooms, public betrayals, broken love stories, addiction, and loss. So much loss. And yet, somehow he's still here. Not the way he used to be, but in a way that maybe, just maybe, is even more powerful. This isn't a comeback, it's something deeper. Because at 62, Johnny Depp isn't revealing a new role or another performance. He's revealing himself, the man behind Jack Sparrow, behind Edward Scissorhands, behind the lawsuits, headlines, and heartbreak. And what he shows us now might just be what we always suspected, but never dared to say out loud. Before Johnny Depp became one of the most recognizable faces on earth, he was just a quiet, wide-eyed boy stumbling through a world that never made space for gentleness. Born on the 9th of June, 1963, in Owensboro, Kentucky, his early years were filled not with warmth, but with constant motion over 20 moves before he turned 18. Each new town felt like a failed promise of stability. But what hurt most wasn't the suitcases or new schools, it was what happened inside the home. The place where a child is supposed to feel safe. Instead, there were slammed doors, screaming matches, and the kind of silence that screamed louder than words. His parents' relationship was a battlefield, and by the time they divorced when Johnny was just 15, it didn't bring relief. It felt like collapse. He would later describe it not as a breakup, but as a volcanic trauma, and he meant it. It shook his foundation, broke his sense of what love was supposed to look like, and left him emotionally homeless. His mother, Betty Sue, soon remarried a man named Robert Palmer, and though his stepfather turned out to be a quiet source of calm, the damage had already been done. The emotional wreckage didn't just disappear. No one asked him how he was. No one gave him the tools to understand what he was feeling. So he did what many children do when the pain gets too loud. He went silent. And inside that silence, something was breaking. At 12 years old, Johnny Depp received a guitar. Not from a rock star, not from a producer, but as a birthday gift, simple, almost forgettable. Except it wasn't. It became the first thing in his life that didn't hurt him. It didn't yell. It didn't hit. It didn't leave. It waited in the corner of his room until he was ready. And when he picked it up, the noise in his mind started to make sense, not with words, but with sound. He wasn't learning chords. He was learning how to breathe again. Music became his escape, his therapy, his voice when he couldn't find one. In the haze of cigarette smoke, broken amplifiers, and garage band rehearsals, Johnny wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing peace. Each strum of the strings felt like a confession, each lyric a wound dressed in rhythm. And yet, even this new lifeline wasn't enough to save him from the ache that school brought every day. At Miramar High, Johnny was a ghost drifting between classrooms, misunderstood, uninterested, undone. The world didn't know how to handle a boy who felt too much, and eventually, he stopped trying to fit into it. At 16, he dropped out. One brief attempt to return was met not with punishment, but with permission. A principal looked at Johnny troubled, drifting, and said something that changed his life forever. Go live it. So he did. Johnny Depp didn't walk into Hollywood with a script in hand or stars in his eyes. He came chasing something entirely different: music. With a band, a beat-up van, and barely enough money for rent, he left Florida for Los Angeles, dreaming of rock stardom. But the city didn't care. The gigs dried up, the phones stopped ringing, the shimmer of making it turned into the dull ache of survival. One by one, the band members gave up, the dream crumbled, and Johnny found himself alone taking odd jobs, staring at stained ceilings, wondering if he'd made a mistake. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a failure screaming in your ear. He hadn't planned for this. The guitar that once soothed him now reminded him of what he couldn't become. He was stuck. No money, no plan. And worst of all, no identity. But like in the best stories, the ones where everything seems lost, fate has a funny way of showing up uninvited. Her name was Laurie Ann Allison. Laurie Ann Allison wasn't just Johnny Depp's first wife. She was his first real believer. While the world saw a broke, failed musician, she saw something else, a quiet fire that hadn't yet found its place to burn. And she introduced him to someone who would change everything: Nicolas Cage. Cage didn't see a rock star without a stage. He saw presence, a raw, untapped energy. He told Johnny to try acting. Depp was skeptical. He'd never taken a class, never memorized a monologue. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't even believe he deserved it. But Cage's confidence was contagious. It cracked something open. Then came the audition. A Nightmare on Elm Street wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even meant to be serious, but when Johnny was cast, it was as if life handed him a mirror. He wasn't supposed to be there, yet somehow he belonged. One moment, he was a boy playing sad songs in dark rooms. The next, he was being pulled into a bed by Freddy Krueger. It was surreal. It was ridiculous. It was fate. Acting, at first, felt like a fluke, but soon he realized it could be more than that. Like music, it was another language, another way to bleed quietly without making a mess. He once said, "I didn't want to be an actor," but acting like the guitar years before didn't care. It came for him anyway. A Nightmare on Elm Street opened a door, but it was 21 Jump Street that kicked it wide open and nearly shut Johnny Depp inside a version of himself he didn't recognize. As Officer Tom Hansen, Johnny became a household name overnight. Teen magazines plastered his face across bedrooms. Malls erupted in screams. Hollywood crowned him the new pretty boy, the next safe bet. To the world, it was a triumph. But to Johnny, it was a cage. He felt like a product marketed, packaged, and sold. Each line he delivered, each smile he posed for, chipped away at the real person hiding beneath. The music had been honest. The pain was real. But this was plastic. I felt like a novelty, he would later confess. A manufactured thing. And so, while the world was celebrating his rise, Johnny Depp began plotting his escape, not from fame, but from the version of himself that fame had invented. If 21 Jump Street made Johnny Depp famous, it also nearly broke him. So he rebelled not with words, but with choices. He stopped taking roles that made him look good. Instead, he started choosing characters that looked like him on the inside, bruised, strange, misunderstood. He played misfits, dreamers, broken men trying to survive in a world that never made space for them. It wasn't about shock value. It was survival. In Crybaby, he mocked the very image Hollywood tried to sell, but it was Edward Scissorhands that changed everything. A boy with blades for hands, unable to touch the world without hurting or being hurt. That wasn't just acting, that was Johnny. Through Tim Burton's lens, he found a mirror. Someone finally understood the language he'd been trying to speak his whole life. And audiences, they felt it. For the first time, they saw past the face and into the soul. What followed were roles that defied the rules. The gentle clown in Benny and June, the haunted wanderer in Dead Man, the oddball romantic in Arizona Dream, and the sincere dreamer in Ed Wood. With each performance, Johnny peeled away the polish and let the pain show. By the early 2002, Johnny Depp was no longer just an actor, he was an enigma, a walking contradiction. A man who never chased stardom, yet carried it like a curse. Then came the role that would define a generation, Captain Jack Sparrow. But what people forget is Disney didn't want him. Executives panicked when they saw his first performance. The slurred words, the erratic gestures, the Keith Richards swagger, it wasn't what they had in mind. They thought he was ruining the film, but Depp knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't acting like a pirate, he was becoming one. Jack Sparrow wasn't clean cut, he wasn't noble, he was a mess. a survivor, a trickster who had seen too much and laughed anyway. Sound familiar? The world didn't just fall in love with Jack. They saw Johnny in him. The movie shattered expectations, grossing over $650 million. Depp earned his first Oscar nomination, then led a billion-dollar franchise. But with every sequel, every press tour, every paycheck, a quiet dread crept in. He wasn't exploring characters anymore. He was repeating one. Jack Sparrow had become a second skin, and it was starting to suffocate him. At the height of his fame, Johnny Depp had everything: blockbuster success, critical acclaim, and a bank account envied by the industry. But inside, he was drifting farther and farther from the artist he once was. The role that gave him the world was slowly draining his soul. He later admitted that playing Jack Sparrow over and over dulled his creative spark. What began as a bold act of rebellion had turned into performance on autopilot. The joy of becoming someone else had faded. Now, he was being expected to remain a character even off camera. He tried to escape through work films like Alice in Wonderland, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The Tourist, but even those felt like echoes of something he no longer recognized. And behind the scenes, his personal life was beginning to crumble. His relationship with French actress and singer Vanessa Paradis, his partner for 14 years, and the mother of his 2 children, was unraveling quietly. There were no screaming headlines, no public fights, just a growing stillness, a sense that something steady had started to slip away. Johnny would later speak of that time, not with bitterness, but with heartbreak, because it wasn't just a breakup. It was the beginning of a fall that would shatter everything. In the wake of his separation from Vanessa Paradis, Johnny Depp wasn't looking for another great love. But sometimes, the heart reaches before the mind can catch up. On the set of The Rum Diary, he met Amber Heard. The chemistry was electric on screen and off. By 2015, they were married. But what looked like a Hollywood fairy tale unraveled faster than anyone expected. Within just a year, Amber filed for divorce, alleging emotional abuse. Depp denied the accusations. What followed wasn't just a breakup, it was a cultural firestorm. Headlines exploded. Social media polarized. Suddenly, Johnny Depp wasn't just an actor. He was a target, a symbol, a spectacle. The man who once guarded his privacy with near obsession was now dissected in public, every text, every photo, every silence, judged by millions. They reached a settlement. They released a joint statement. But for Johnny, the damage had already been done. His name, a name once tied to brilliance and originality, now echoed in scandal. And the worst was yet to come. In December 2018, Amber Heard published an op-ed in the Washington Post. She didn't name Johnny Depp directly, but the implication was clear. She presented herself as a survivor of abuse, and in doing so, cast a long, damning shadow. Johnny responded with a $50 million defamation lawsuit. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about survival. Roles vanished. Franchises distanced themselves. He was dropped from Fantastic Beasts, and Pirates of the Caribbean quietly closed its doors to him. He didn't just lose jobs, he lost his legacy. The court case dragged on for years. Both sides presented recordings, texts, and contradictory timelines. It wasn't just a legal battle, it became a global obsession. Millions tuned in, not for justice, but for drama. And Johnny, once seen as untouchable, stood vulnerable in a courtroom, exposing his pain to the world. When the jury finally ruled in his favor in 2022, it felt like a public resurrection, a moment of vindication. But even as he said, "The jury gave me my life back," there was no celebration in his voice. Because the truth is, the verdict couldn't return the lost years, the stolen peace, the emotional wreckage. It could only offer silence after the storm. When the cameras stopped flashing and the courtroom emptied, Johnny Depp didn't run back to movie sets or red carpets. He returned to where it all began. Music. It wasn't about fame anymore. It wasn't about being seen. It was about healing. In the middle of a media circus and personal devastation, music remained the one place that didn't betray him. In 2015, he had co-founded Hollywood Vampires with rock legends Alice Cooper and Joe Perry. But after the trial, the band became more than a side project. It became a sanctuary, a stage where he didn't have to explain himself, where the only thing louder than the gossip was the sound of his guitar. He wasn't Johnny Depp, the disgraced actor. He was just Johnny, the boy from Kentucky, who survived by writing pain into chords. The lights were softer, the applause was purer, and in those moments, something inside him started to come back. Not all at once, but enough to remind him that even after losing everything, there was still a song left to play. While his public image crumbled, Johnny Depp disappeared into a world few could imagine, a surreal, extravagant empire built not for attention, but for escape. He wasn't just buying houses, he was building sanctuaries, emotional bunkers, a 37-acre French village restored for the family he once had, 5 penthouses in Los Angeles, a sprawling horse farm in Kentucky, private islands in the Bahamas, a 156-foot yacht named after the people he loved, Vajolaroya, Vanessa, Johnny, Lily Rose, and Jack. On the outside, it looked like excess, lavish indulgence. But to those who understood, it was something else entirely. Control. Depp was a man losing everything: his marriage, his career, his dignity. And so, he built castles in the clouds to feel safe while the ground beneath him collapsed. His spending was staggering: $30,000 a month on wine, $200,000 a month on private jets, over $300,000 monthly on staff and security. It wasn't greed. It was grief disguised as grandeur. In 2017, when his lawsuit against his former management company revealed the scope of it all, fans were stunned. But buried in the headlines was a man simply trying to hold on to pieces of himself, because when the world sees you as a myth, it's easy to forget that myths can bleed too. The lawsuits didn't just expose Johnny Depp's finances, they exposed the fragility of a life built on survival. The French village? Sold. The penthouses? Gone. Even the beloved Vajolaroya, his floating tribute to the family he lost, was sold to J.K. Rowling. He wasn't just letting go of assets, he was letting go of memories too heavy to carry. His empire, once worth over $650 million, was crumbling. Not because he stopped working, but because he had poured his fortune into emotion, into grief, into escape, into trying to recreate something that fame had stolen long ago. Those close to him began to notice the change. He wasn't angry. He was tired. His eyes had lost their flicker. His voice, once sharp with rebellion, had turned inward. The lawsuits, the betrayals, the public undressing, they didn't just cost him money. They stripped away the myth, and all that was left was the man, alone, quiet, still breathing, but not the way he used to. Johnny Depp didn't go out in flames. He faded slowly, quietly into a kind of exile of his own choosing. The parties stopped, the cameras lost interest. The world, once obsessed, moved on. But in that silence, something sacred began to take shape. He wasn't trying to return to what was. He was trying to understand what mattered. The star was gone. The myth was broken. And from the rubble, a man began to rebuild not his career, but his soul. Gone were the roles, the image, the need to be understood by strangers. In their place was something more fragile, more human: peace. It didn't come quickly, and it didn't come without cost. But in letting go of the illusion, Johnny found something he had never truly had in all his decades of fame freedom. Not to perform, not to impress, but to simply be. And in that quiet reckoning, he didn't just survive. He softened. He slowed down. He began again, not with a script, but with stillness. These days, Johnny Depp lives far from flashing cameras and frantic schedules. Tucked into a village in the French countryside, his world has grown smaller and infinitely more real. No more entourages, no red carpets, no chasing roles, just the stillness of nature, the brushstrokes of his paintings, and the hum of a guitar under his fingertips. Sometimes he travels to England for music, a private concert, a quiet collaboration. But he always returns to solitude by choice, not despair. He no longer defines himself by the zeros on a paycheck. After losing an estimated $400 million, his current net worth between $150, $200 million isn't seen as a fall from grace. It's a return to balance. He spends carefully now on what matters, on art, on music, on moments. His staff is small, his circle even smaller. He's not interested in rebuilding an empire. He's interested in building peace. And at the heart of this new life are two names that never left his lips, even in his darkest moments: Lily Rose and Jack. For all the characters Johnny Depp has played, none have meant more than the role he never rehearsed: father. Becoming a dad didn't just change him, it anchored him. When Lily Rose and Jack entered his life, they gave him something he had never truly known growing up: roots. A reason to stay grounded, a compass to follow when everything else felt directionless. He once said, "My kids gave me a real foundation." And that wasn't just a line, it was the truth behind every decision he made, even when the world was falling apart. Lily Rose, now a rising star in her own right, remains his closest emotional mirror, and Jack, fiercely private lives in the protection Johnny fought so hard to preserve. Even during the lawsuits, the scandals, the collapse of his reputation, he never lashed out publicly for fear of how it might affect them. He didn't just survive for himself, he survived for them, because in their eyes, he didn't need to be a myth. He just needed to be dad. Johnny Depp once wore his heart like a badge, loud, romantic, and often reckless. His name was etched onto the skin of passion: Winona Forever, Kate Moss, Vanessa Paradis, Amber Heard. Each chapter louder than the last. But now, there are no grand gestures, no screaming headlines, no whirlwind romances. After the wreckage, Johnny has chosen solitude, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Whispers of a quiet connection with his former attorney, Joel Rich, came and went, barely leaving a mark. And that, in itself, says everything. He's no longer chasing validation in someone else's arms, no longer searching for a partner to fill a void. Only he can heal. This is a man who has loved hard, lost deeply, and finally accepted that peace isn't found in another person. It's found in learning how to stand alone and still feel whole. Even as Johnny Depp withdrew from the spotlight, concerns about his health began to surface. He looked thinner, slower, tired. There were whispers. Was he okay? Had the years finally caught up? A foot injury forced him to cancel shows. Fans worried. The world watched. Again, not with judgment, but with quiet fear. Because for the first time, even his most loyal supporters saw a man no longer hiding the weight he carried. But then came Cannes. Johnny stepped onto the red carpet with silver hair, a dignified beard, and eyes that had clearly seen too much and yet still shimmered with life. He wasn't returning as a star. He was returning as a survivor. In Jean du Barry, he portrayed a haunted soul drifting in grief. It wasn't just a role, it was an echo. The performance felt lived in, not acted. Critics applauded the vulnerability, the restraint. And when the standing ovation came, it wasn't for a comeback, it was for endurance. Johnny Depp hadn't just made it back to the screen, he had made it through the fire. Once upon a time, Johnny Depp measured his worth in scripts, salaries, and the roar of a crowd. Now, he measures it in quiet, in presence, in truth. He no longer courts the industry that once devoured him. "I don't think about Hollywood anymore," he said, not with spite, but with freedom. He paints in silence, plays guitar without a stage, writes words that may never be read. He's not performing for us. He's living for himself. What once looked like retreat is actually resurrection. And it's not loud. It's deliberate, gentle, clear. Depp isn't chasing a second act. He's building a new life, one where art exists without the need for approval and where identity is no longer shaped by roles, but by resilience. And for those who followed him not for fame, but for his humanity, this might be his most powerful performance yet. Today, Johnny Depp walks roads far removed from the ones that made him a legend. There are no handlers, no screaming fans, no flashbulbs chasing his shadow, just France. Nature, silence. He lives tucked away in a quiet village where the world slows down and time finally listens. When he crosses the channel to England, it's not for premieres, it's for music, collaboration, connection. Then he returns to solitude, as if refueling on stillness. The excess is gone, the empire scaled back, from hundreds of millions to a fraction of what once was. But there's no shame in what's been lost, because what remains is more honest. He invests in what moves his spirit, art, music, his children, not out of strategy but sincerity. He's no longer the firebrand rebel, no longer the myth. He's a man older, wiser, scarred, but standing. And for the first time, he doesn't need to be anyone else. Johnny Depp's story was never truly about fame or roles or the rise and fall of a Hollywood icon. It was always something deeper. It was about a man raw, flawed, human, stumbling through fire, through grief, through the wreckage of a life too big to hold. A man who once wore eyeliner and symbols and characters like armor, who gave everything to the world and lost nearly all of himself in return. And yet, here he is, not restored, reborn. He doesn't speak in sound bites anymore. He speaks in moments, in brushstrokes, in melodies, in silence. He's no longer chasing relevance. He's chasing meaning, not applause, peace. He walks barefoot now through vineyards, through past mistakes, through the soft soil of a life that no longer demands a mask. And in that walk, there is strength, stillness, truth. Johnny Depp isn't the legend we lost. He's the man we never truly saw until now. And that, perhaps, is his greatest role yet. Thank you for walking through the fire with him. What part of his journey spoke to you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts below.